You are now being joined to your conference.
Andrew is a principal consultant within Aon Hewitt's EMEA reward practice with 15 years of consulting experience. He has led a number of equal pay audits and was active in the consultation process for the recently introduced regulations. We're also delighted to have Audrey with us today. Audrey is a partner at HR law group City law firm Fox Williams. She is an expert in discrimination, harassment and equal pay and has worked closely with ACAS government as well as the CBI on equality legislation. Aon Hewitt and Fox Williams together create a really strong team on gender pay issues, providing combined legal and HR advice. We at Aon provide the HR and reward perspective with deep experience in conducting equal pay audits and assessing the impact of pay differentials on talent, performance and reward. Fox Williams, meanwhile, our leading employment lawyers experienced in advising on and defending equal pay claims and with unparalleled knowledge of equality legislation. Together, we can provide advice and analysis under the protection of legal privilege. Just before I hand over to Jane, a quick administrative point. There will be a question and answer session at the end of today's call, and we invite you to submit your questions using the chat function at the side of the webinar screen. Don't wait till the end, just ask questions throughout and we'll answer all the questions we can at the end of the session. We'll also distribute information about the slides and a replay of the webinar in the coming few days via email. Thank you all for your time and attention. I hope you find today's webinar informative and useful. Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm Jane Mann. I'm head of Fox Williams HR Law Group, and this webinar follows on from our first very successful webinar in which we looked at the draft regulations and their implications for all of you. Today's agenda is set up on the screen, and you will see from that that we're doing a legislative update in terms of Audrey will let us know where things have got to. We're following up on some of the unanswered questions on the regulations. We're looking to understand what is driving the gender pay gap in organisations, and we will be making practical recommendations on the next steps we think you should be taking in order to comply with the regulations and to deal with any underlying issues they may throw up. We're highlighting some of the risks that the new regulations may present, and we're investigating gender pay gap statistics. So, Audrey, I think it's time for you to bring us all up to date with where things have got, because the last we heard was that the consultation had closed and we're waiting for the final regulations.
Yes, thank you, Jane. So let's deal firstly with the timetable and whether we're still on track for, of course, implementation on the 1st of October with the first reporting cycle due at the end of April 2018. Now, the reality is it's quite tight in terms of parliamentary time, and we may not get the final revised regulations until we're told the summer of this year, but we do expect the regulations to be laid ready for implementation on the October date. It's going through what's called an affirmative resolution procedure, so that should speed the process and keep to the timetable. But what it really means is that if we stick with that timescale, from next week, the bonuses and incentive arrangements that you are going to be implementing and paying out will become reportable. And that's because although you're reporting by the 29th of April 2018, the reporting that you're doing is on bonuses paid in the 12 months to April of next year. A couple of things to say about what we expect to be revisited in the draft regulations. Certainly, it looks like the definition of employees is going to be extended to include those working personally under contracts, not just under contract of employment. So not all the data is necessarily going to be obtained via payroll. There will be some amendments to the definition of pay, possibly to include other family payments, such as shared parental leave. And there will undoubtedly be, because there's been a waging debate about how to define bonuses, particularly this concept of the cash equivalent value of shares. And the final area, and it's one that the Financial Reporting Council has made representations on, is should there be scope to report based on the group level rather than each subsidiary and legal entity, and that seems to be coming up for debate at the moment. So those are the things to watch out for. In terms of the timetable that I mentioned, Andrew, what steps are you recommending for us to get ready for that April 2018 date?
Thank you, Audrey. Well, we're recommending 4 pretty clear steps, and today we'll really be structuring the call around these recommendations to get ready for implementation. Step 1, we're recommending you really review your diversity strategy. As we'll explore shortly, gender pay gap legislation really highlights the consequence of what is essentially a diversity challenge here. So, to fix the gender pay gap numbers, you need a long-term strategy to address diversity, essentially to get more women into middle and senior management posts. And to do that, you need a broad group of internal stakeholders to make this happen. You're going to need to have senior management engaged. Remember that you're going to have a senior executive to sign off on your numbers for gender pay reporting. But you need to develop a broader team around that as well, from a range of functions, including talent and development, compensation, of course, but also legal and the communications team as well, both internal employee communications and your external PR piece as well. Point 2, we would suggest you really consider legal privilege up front before you start conducting any analysis. And I'm really delighted we have Audrey and Jane with us here today who are going to talk around the risks and challenges in this area a little bit later on. Thirdly, we do strongly recommend that you start to calculate your gender pay gap numbers now. I mean, you have 2 years before you need to publish, but as Audrey just mentioned, this in terms of the bonus numbers, the reporting year starts from now. You need to understand what your numbers look like. You need to investigate them. You need to understand the key drivers and what are some of the underlying causes. So I would say, regardless of what industry you're in, your numbers are probably not going to look great. So you need to start developing that story and have time to address any equal pay issues that you may indeed unearth. And then finally, we recommend that you conduct an equal pay audit. You can really only investigate what the underlying causes are if you actually conduct a full equal pay audit. And our recommendation as well is that this would be a broad audit that would also incorporate an analysis of your company's diversity profile as it stands today. So more to come on these areas a little bit later, but let's just take a look at some of the other initiatives that are going on at the moment. And Audrey, I know you're working very closely with ACAS on some of the guidance around gender pay reporting. Can you provide us with a bit more context on this?
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to actually ask you out there to help us to work with ACAS and give us your suggestions, actually. So one of the things we're expecting on the back of the regulations is some guidance from ACAS on gender pay reporting, but possibly some wider issues. So we wanted to ask for your input, really, because we're talking to ACAS. We will undoubtedly give input on that guidance. What information, and there's a question that's going to pop up on your screens in a moment, we'd like to ask you to vote on what information you think would be most helpful to your organisations to have in the ACAS guidance. There's a number of options there that we've given you. Are you interested in the business case? Understanding why the pay gap exists? Do you want some examples of group disadvantage? Or do you want worked examples on the regulations themselves and how you present the information? And bear in mind, I think some of you are already voting quite quickly. You can vote for more than one of these options. We will feed this back to ACAS and give them some input as to what you're looking for. Just whilst we're waiting for those results, we also hear that the Equality Commission may be looking to revisit their Equal Pay Toolkit, which again will be encouraging beyond the reporting, looking at detail at your pay gaps. And we're going to come back in a moment to the work that is being done in the Guardia report, some sector-specific issues. And of course, we're waiting for the Women and Equalities Committee recommendations to be responded to by government. So, Andrew, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the wider diversity challenges which are informing Guardia and the Women and Equalities Committee?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, perhaps before I do that, I mean, I guess just to mention that there's a whole range of government initiatives out there at the moment, whether it's reviews or legislation. So, we've seen a significant change, I guess, with the introduction of the new living wage now coming up to £7.20, and, this is certainly going to have an impact on pay equality for the lowest paid in society, where we know the majority of these posts are filled by part-time female workers. And we've also seen other legislation around the introduction of shared parental leave to really encourage fathers to share childcare responsibility and get more women back in the workplace and developing their careers. So perhaps just before I do that, should we just take a quick look at the poll and
Yes,
see what that's telling us?
Just going to post up the results in a moment. They'll be appearing on your screen.
Okay.
And I think perhaps not surprisingly, the vast majority are saying that actually having some worked examples of the actual gender pay reporting,
yes.
What should it look like, what sort of tables, sort of narrative, I suspect, is also really thought to be beneficial, and group examples. So a lot of you seem to be quite comfortable with the business case and understanding the gaps. The other thing to say is you've got the chat box and you're posting questions as we speak. If there are other things you want to suggest is included in that ACAS guidance, do by all means send that into us.
Yes, no, that's very interesting and similar to what we've been hearing from our clients. So we will come back to the gender pay gap reporting piece actually in just a moment. But before we get into the specifics around pay, I'd just like to take a brief look at diversity and some of the challenges that we have. If we just move to the next slide, please. So on the slide you can see now we're presenting the kind of social drivers and I guess almost the company drivers where diversity is a challenge. And we know in society today that an overwhelming portion of women take on the responsibility of the primary carer, whether it's childcare, disability or elderly relatives. So at the core of this, there is that social driver. We also see a piece around education as well, trying to attract enough top talent and women into certain degrees, such as engineering and construction in particular, have found it a real challenge to attract women into those areas. Industry culture, of course, is another very key area. I heard some interesting research from a leading business school yesterday, really highlighting that there's a minority of women even considering a career in FS simply because of the perception around it being very male-dominated, very competitive culture. So finally on this one, I guess I'll just mention the broader cultural expectations on fathers. So isn't it interesting that since the introduction of shared parental leave, only 2% of men have actually taken up extended paternity leave.
And have you seen the controversy about that statistic? Because the 2% is of the men polled, not actually of the men eligible, i.e. you do need a newborn baby to actually be able to qualify.
Absolutely, yeah. So the numbers are even more shocking. And I guess the key driver appears to be the concern that it will adversely affect pay and career prospects. And interestingly, this week we've also seen some research that shows fathers attract a pay premium for each child, whilst women suffer from pay discount. So ironically, perhaps, the diversity issue may be better tackled by addressing these cultural expectations on fathers. Audrey, any other thoughts that are coming out from the Women's Inequalities Committee that you'd like to comment on?
Well, interestingly, that last point was focused on in one of the recommendations, because two of the really important recommendations from that committee was that there should be 3 months non-transferable and well-paid leave for fathers and second parents, really as a way of encouraging this idea of sharing parental responsibility. And the second, and I think even more interesting proposal, was about requiring employers to allow all jobs to be worked flexibly by default. So it's only by exception and where you can justify it. And I think we're going to get much more information, guidance and pressure on flexible and agile working.
Yes, absolutely. So, clearly there's broader society issues, but clearly as employers, we ourselves have a challenge to address these diversity issues that exist. And I think we'd agree, some of these examples here, it is around other broader areas. And it's interesting when we look at financial services in particular, where we've got some companies that are really focusing on diversity targets and quotas. So if we can just move to the next slide, I want to just bring your attention to the Guardia review. This is a charter that, well, initially this was commissioned. Jane Guardia, CEO of Virgin Money, was commissioned to undertake a review to really tackle the diversity challenge of getting more women into senior posts within the financial services industry. And we know in FS that it is the industry with the highest pay gap, and also, the highest pay, and also the largest pay gap. We also know that only 14% of women are present on executive committees, and 25% of boards, in fact, have no female representation at all. So there's clearly an issue here that they're looking to tackle, and it's interesting because it comes from a diversity angle rather than from trying to simply address the pay angle. So the charter that companies are being asked to sign up to, we've already got all the big four banks who are committed to this, but there's essentially four key aspects that companies will need to pledge to. One is having a senior executive responsible and accountable for diversity and inclusion. And we know, these things don't get corrected unless you've got strong senior management support to make them happen. Companies are being asked to set their own internal targets around gender diversity. Companies are allowed to set those targets themselves and establish what's right for them, and they need to publish these annually. But interestingly, there's this link to pay. This has just come out last month, so we're not quite sure in what form this is going to transpire, but there is a requirement, or an intention at least, that pay is linked through. So I think there we've covered the longer-term diversity issues. I guess now we'd just like to transition to some of the shorter-term risks and start to get into the detail of what some of the numbers are saying. Now, before we do that, it's important at this stage to discuss legal privilege. And this is an area that is often raised by our clients wanting to undertake equal pay analysis. So, Jane, if I can turn to you, for the benefit of everyone on the call, can you provide some context on what legal advice privilege actually is, and why is it so important?
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. I think the starting point for understanding this issue is the fact that a lot of data will be collated and analysed as a result of the new regulations, and also if companies choose to carry out equal pay audits. And the data is already available in organisations, but the process of collating it and analysing it will create new, easily accessible charts, spreadsheets, and analysis of the data. And should that data reveal that the organisation is vulnerable to equal pay claims, that data could be prejudicial to an organisation if claims are subsequently brought by employees or groups of employees, as is happening in certain companies. So we think that it's advisable for companies to think about doing that analysis under the protection of legal privilege. And so the way that works is for a company or an employer to instruct lawyers to give advice on equal pay issues, equal pay audits, and gender pay gap reporting. And if a company or an employer asks for legal advice, then the response and also the communication asking for advice is covered by legal privilege. So if we were instructed, we could ask Aon to carry out analysis for clients, and we could deliver back to the client legal advice resting on the analysis carried out by Aon. This is important when claims are brought, because companies and respondents have to produce data in the process of disclosure during legal proceedings, and that is the point at which companies are vulnerable if they have created prejudicial documentation. It's not every communication to a law firm that is covered by privilege, but only communications which ask for legal advice. It's not just enough to send an email to your lawyer. And when you get the answers back from the law firm, you have to be careful, because you have to keep the information confidential. You must not disseminate it beyond those who are seeking the legal advice. And you have to watch out before you instruct lawyers, because preparatory work is also not privileged. It's only the actual instructions to the lawyers. So I hope that's a helpful briefing on privilege and its importance. And I think, Andrew, we can now turn to you and ask you, based on Aon's analysis, what are the high-risk industries?
Sure. So we, as many of you will be aware, we have large compensation databases and surveys. So we've just done a bit of research into where we see currently the highest gender pay gaps today, and from our research, you can see up on the screen, these are the kind of industries where the gaps are the largest. And I guess in part this is going to be down to some of the diversity challenges that we've mentioned earlier. But if we put that to one side, Audrey, from your perspective, can you share what are the other characteristics that may raise a company's risk profile?
So in addition to the sectors, obviously there are some sectors which have a history of claims, and we've got lots of experience of those employers that have, in the last 10 or 15 years, faced very large, very significant, having to sell off assets to pay their equal pay liability. But there seems to be a resurgence now, a new trend of new claims, particularly around the retail sector, warehousing, distribution, and I think the other areas of risk might be where you've got large volumes of low-paid staff, and if you drill down to analyse that, you anticipate that you've got what I would describe as occupational groups that are very biased by gender, so large concentrated groups of female staff in one occupational group and male staff in another. The other areas actually might well be where you have been busy with mergers and acquisitions and you've inherited perhaps pay and bonus arrangements and where you've got differential terms operating, because don't forget, you can actually potentially bring an equal pay claim across a group, so intra-company comparisons are possible. And then the final area is, if you've got strong trade union membership, I anticipate the unions will be very interested in this data. We'll probably be looking, perhaps via collective bargaining requests and statutory provisions, to get this information from you to drill down further into the gender pay reporting information that you might publish. Andrew, just bearing those considerations in mind, the reality is, in order to collate your gender pay reporting information, you do need to understand the background statistics and analysis. What sort of information are we looking for?
Yeah, so if we just take a look back, this is one of the slides from our previous webinar. This is really showing, as we understand the draft legislation today, what the requirements are going to be. Now, I'm not going to go through this again in detail. We can share with you the slides from our last webinar if you haven't seen them. But in essence, these are the kind of numbers in pink that you're going to need to disclose. And here, in the numbers that are being circled, you can see some of the challenges where you might have quite a big difference between your median and mean pay that you're reporting, showing a great deal of disparity between high pay within your organization. You're going to see big differences in bonus on an annual basis. And of course, you've got this very interesting diversity profile in the bottom of this table here, where you can really see where's the glass ceiling, if you like, or where is the block for women actually progressing up through the organization. So I guess we can see from this the numbers are not going to look great. Our recommendation is really to get stuck in and really start having a look at this now. And I've seen a few questions come up on the questions and chat box, just saying, you know, it's important we do not confuse here gender pay reporting, which essentially addresses or highlights a diversity issue, with equal pay law, right? So once you've analysed your gender pay gap statistics, the numbers aren't going to look great. But Audrey, we shouldn't automatically jump to the conclusion that we have an equal pay issue, right?
Absolutely right. And as we say here, don't confuse gender pay reporting and the actual equal pay legislation, because they're very different animals. Of course, gender pay reporting will be looking out on an aggregate, and as we've just seen from Andrew's table, very high-level trends and statistics. When it comes to equal pay, however, whilst having the gender pay information and that report up your sleeve, if you like, if you're an individual employee, is helpful, it's not going to prove or establish your equal pay claim. So we just thought we would use the storyboard of Bob and Rita, and you can see that they are both actually in a Band E system in terms of their jobs. Bob's working in finance, Rita's working in marketing. Now, imagine that Rita sees the table that Andrew's just taken you through and looks in particular at the bonus differential between men and women and also at the pay bands in particular, the quartiles. She may begin to suspect or be concerned that she might be being underpaid. Now, actually, what would she do in order to drill down further? Bear in mind, she might start asking questions, but she would have to point to Bob as her comparator in order to launch an equal pay claim. And she would also be protected in raising those questions because she's given legal protection against victimisation. She can have pay discussions and she can't be penalised for that. And she has the ammunition of being able to issue questionnaires asking for more information. Moving on, it's also important to bear in mind that so far as Rita's concerned, she would be entitled to look for equality in each individual element of her pay. So this isn't an overall package approach. It may be that she is getting, let's say, the same bonus payment, the same reward element around holiday and other benefits as Bob, but actually if their pay is different, she could seek equality just on the base pay element. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is for Rita to get her personal equal pay claim off the ground, she would need to establish that she is either doing work which is rated as equivalent to Bob, or that it's like work, and like work is very much a factual assessment, and the more troublesome area, and where there is an extensive litigation process, she would need to demonstrate that their jobs, although they might be very different, are of equal value, and that would be her responsibility to start off with. Now, obviously, in terms of job evaluation schemes, this rated as equivalent, that first bullet, or jobs being of equal value, there is a significant area of assessment and work to be done. And I'm just going to ask Jackie to take us through, in a bit more detail, what sort of factors do you look at to have either a reliable grading system or some sort of valuation process?
Yeah, thanks, Audrey. And you know, I certainly think it's right that any organisation considering looking at an equal pay review or audit of any kind, really that is predicated on understanding how the jobs relate to each other and how you maintain that equal value position. And the starting point for that is having a decent job evaluation or grading methodology. Now, as most of us will be aware, there are a variety of ways of creating grading systems in an organisation, ranging from reasonably high-level, externally based approaches to very detailed points factor evaluations. Our experience shows that actually for equal pay purposes, a robust analytical job evaluation system that essentially anything on the right side of this spectrum that we show here, which breaks the job down into a factor-based analysis and is therefore seen as an analytical system, will provide a reasonably robust way to compare jobs for an equal pay audit or review that we may be conducting internally, but will also enable you to have some kind of defence in any equal pay tribunal cases that may arise. I think this is probably also a good point to talk about the risks that may arise from any equal pay litigation that comes your way. There are a variety of risk areas that may arise, particularly so on the operational and commercial side, thinking about, okay, so we've had an equal pay claim come against us. We now need to think about what do we do around pay and performance management, for example, significant costs that may arise around reworking that, paying out claims, thinking about contractual changes, big piece of work, big potential cost for an organisation, and also commercially looking at, okay, how is that going to impact our procurement, our bid process, our commercial positioning in the market if we're, if in the public domain we've had some equal pay concerns. So a variety of areas there in the operational commercial side, but obviously also on the litigation side. Audrey, perhaps you can talk a little bit more about the risks that arise there.
Yes, and we've already highlighted gender pay reporting may obviously increase awareness. And one of the things just to bear in mind when we're thinking about how much detail and what's the value of an equal pay audit is that one thing a tribunal can order if an individual equal pay case is lost by an employer is that you conduct an equal pay audit for groups or for the organisation as a whole. But if you've already done that in the last 3 years, then it is unlikely the tribunal would actually order that. when we're looking at the potential financial liability, bear in mind that winning an equal pay claim means that I get an equality clause into my contract. Now, in Rita's case, for example, let's assume she wins her claim. Her equality clause that will say you must be paid the same base pay as Bob unless there are good reasons why there is a differential. She could also claim up to 6 years back pay, and if you've got groups of claimants, of course, that's 6 years back pay per individual. And I've mentioned what are called, and there are animal similes all around here, piggyback claims or leapfrogging. Let's assume Rita wins her claim and she's used Bob as her comparator, but working alongside Rita also in marketing is a male employee called Harry. Now, if you increase Rita's pay, but maintain Harry at his existing level, he actually would then have an equal pay claim using Rita as his comparator. So that's what we mean by leapfrogging claims. And then finally, when we're talking about fixing issues and addressing contractual changes, very careful thought needs to be given to pay protection and pay cushioning. How are you going to equalise, usually over a period, because you're balancing what is correcting discrimination against obviously having to get either agreement and increasing and equalising individuals in terms of their benefits. So we've touched on equal pay auditing. Jackie, do you want to talk a little bit about how do you actually, if you've done the analysis, work out where your high-risk areas are if you're auditing?
Okay, and I think really that, you know, we have a view on the best approach to conducting an equal pay audit and how you may then kind of delve under the bonnet a little bit more to find out what's happening. Essentially, I mean, initially there's a bit of diversity testing in the organisation to understand, okay, so where are the male-female differences occurring in, you know, where your employees are sitting could help set the context for any pay review, an equal pay review, and also can help inform any kind of longer-term talent issues as well. But the critical part is to identify, okay, so where are the key risks? And that's much more, as we said, about comparing individual components of pay across grades. So therefore, if you have a decent evaluator system, you're comparing pay for equal work across the organisation, across the genders, to understand, okay, so where do I have some key risk areas? If you start breaking that down into job families and grades, focusing on jobs with large populations, perhaps focusing on jobs where you think there may be some key risk areas. That will have really helped to understand, so in this example, you know, under a traffic light system, where are my red areas versus where are my green areas? Once you understand which parts of your organisation those red areas are in, so where my big differences are, then you need to think, okay, so let me start thinking about what my material factor defence may be. Audrey's going to talk in a moment about what we mean by material factor defence. But essentially, it's understanding how and why those differences are arising, and is that an area that may be defensible. So actually, we have a set of very robust tests which enable you to dig under that bonnet a bit and understand what are the key areas. So if we move on to the next slide, some of the main reasons where pay differences may arise, and some of these may be defensible, some of them not, as I mentioned, Audrey will talk about that in a minute, may be around some company processes, so things around your policies or reward strategy, some historical areas around M&A, 2P growth by acquisition, for example. Some of it may be much more woolly lack of governance around pay and how that's managed. There are also some areas which are much more based on individual discretion and decisions, typically by managers, around things like starting salaries, performance management ratings, merit cycle decisions, and those pieces as well, which may be the underlying causes of any pay differences by gender. So, Audrey, do you want to pick up a bit on what may be used as actually a material factor defence for any differences in pay?
Yes, so we've looked at this example of, you know, how, or rather, why has the pay differential arisen? Let's look at Rita and Bob again. Let's say it's a £20,000 pay difference between them. The question is, material factor defence. Can you actually demonstrate that the reason for the difference has got nothing to do with gender, i.e. it's genuine, it's non-discriminatory, and it accounts, importantly, for the whole of the difference? Just two other things to bear in mind in terms of that material factor defence. Let's assume with Rita and Bob it's down to what the employer suggests is market forces. So the question would be, how do you demonstrate that that 20k difference is genuinely down to the market? And actually, have you done some analysis? Is it current? Is it up to date? And is it really a 20k difference? Because if it's only a 10k difference due to the market, it doesn't account for the whole of the difference in pay, and you will not succeed on your complaint. And I've also mentioned take care with indirect discrimination, because if you've got pay practices that actually disadvantage the female employees or male employees, then you are going to have to work even harder and demonstrate that the practice is objectively justified, necessary and appropriate, and you will really be called to account on that. So that's in essence, what the material factor defence is really looking at. You can see there's a lot of work and a lot of considerations to bear in mind.
Well, thanks very much, Audrey, Jackie and Andrew. And it's back to me, Jane, to wrap up this section. And you will see on screen at the moment our next steps the recommendations for next steps. And you will see that we are recommending that you conduct an equal pay audit. And we're just interested to know, and yes, results are perhaps coming in on our poll, as to whether or not this is part of your planning at the moment. Just running through our recommendations, just to wrap up this bit, you will have heard earlier on that we are suggesting that you review and develop your diversity strategy, and Andrew talked about that. We talked about legal privilege and how you might use that in order to assess short-term problems. We are talking about how we're recommending how you may be able to calculate your GPR statistics now with effect from the 29th of April 2016, so you can see how they might shape up. And back to equal pay audits, what are the results? Not quite finished yet, or? We're just coming up now. We have 17 seconds to go on the poll, and it's proving to be quite interesting. It looks as if a few people have recently conducted an audit. Some are planning. Some are planning to do it under privilege, and some have no plans. So there's quite a split there. And I think we have the final results in now. And so there's a spread of reactions there, I think. I don't know, Andrew and Audrey, whether you want to comment at all on those results?
It's quite evenly spread, actually, between those that have recently conducted, have plans, and actually a fair number who have no plans. Whether that changes after today's discussion, it will be interesting to see.
So during the session, we've had a few questions come in from a variety of people. And I think one of the first questions that's popped up on screen, perhaps Audrey, you could comment on this, is equal pay law also applicable for private companies? Because I think there's a perception out there, isn't there, that this is mainly a public sector problem, but actually that's not true, is it?
Absolutely. And the reason it's perceived as a public sector problem is because that's been the sector that has had mass equal pay claims. But the reality is it is law that applies to private employers as well as public employers. And what we are seeing now is a trend where claims are being brought against private sector organisations.
And a question that's probably come in for me is, can advice be sought from an in-house lawyer, or does it need to be external? The answer is that it can be sourced from an in-house lawyer, but you have to be very careful in-house to separate out communications that are for legal advice and business admin type communications, because of course if a lawyer's in-house, they're involved in the management and things can get a little bit muddled up, which could result in the loss of privilege. So you have to be very careful about how you instruct your in-house legal team, but it is possible and they will know the rules themselves. So maybe we should have a look at a question for Andrew. Equal pay claims. How do skill shortages fit alongside jobs of equal job grade, i.e. two jobs at the same job grade but one earns higher because of scarcer skills? I would assume this could be justifiable?
It could be justifiable, absolutely. I mean, that potentially could come under a material factor defence of market forces. But I guess Audrey would probably just caution that, you know, if the market itself is indeed biased, then you could be on slightly shaky ground. But,
yes. And I do see situations where actually all the employer does is match the market and import the gender bias that's going on in the market into their own pay arrangements. The other issue that we've both seen in the past is it's one thing to assert that's the reason, but quite another to actually have the evidence and data to support it.
Yes.
So another question that's come in is, will the regulations bite in relation to partners? And this is one of the big unanswered questions, I think, Audrey.
It is, absolutely. And I think the answer to the question is quite possibly. And I'm sorry I can't be more specific on it, but given the stated intention of the Government Equalities Office is to cover and protect workers and include those as individuals that need to be reported on, then unless you are kind of truly an owner of the business type partner, we think that members, fixed share partners, salary partners will have to be included in these gender pay reporting figures going forward.
And there's one or two other questions coming in. Any ideas on when we can expect clarification on long-term incentive schemes valuation? I think that's probably just awaiting the final regulations. And there are questions about people outside of the UK. I think that's another one we haven't got that much clarity on at the moment. We think probably not, unless they're attached to the UK in some way.
I think the reality is there are two elements. You would have to be employed under a UK contract of employment, which is subject to UK law. Now, that needs a bit of finessing and clarifying, but if someone is outside of the UK, that's where they're working, they're not on a UK contract, then they're likely to fall outside of these provisions. And one or 2 points about contracts. How would you go about amending contracts? You, Audrey, maybe, and then perhaps some other comments? Yeah, I mean, the issues about, let's say you have to address some of your pay inequalities, actually eradicating the inequality and changing the contract. I mean, we could do another webinar or two on that, but obviously you do need to then move on from, it's not just equal pay advice and discrimination advice, but contractual advice that you need to think about. You've got contract law to bear in mind. Can you agree the changes? Do you collectively bargain to implement them? You would also have to think about whether there's a collective consultation piece, and ultimately, depending on how far you want to push through the change, you may find that you are at risk of constructive or unfair dismissal. So there's very great care that needs to be taken if you're looking to make contractual changes.
Yeah, something coming in on benchmarking services, obviously a key part of reward consultants' work. Andrew, have you had comments on how benchmarking exercises need to consider the sort of gender pay reporting issues?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple of dimensions here. One is around actually benchmarking the gender pay gap. I guess what we've just mentioned there, as we mentioned earlier on in the call, if you're doing any analysis on your gender pay statistics, you just need to be aware that if that's not underprivileged, then it could become discoverable. So if you're sharing any of that type of information, then you need to assess those risks. But more broadly, I think aside from that, the data for general surveys tends to come in a far more of a kind of raw data format, and it's down to companies to decide how they analyse the figures themselves.
Yeah, a couple of final questions coming in before we need to wrap up. So any tips for avoiding piggybacking or leapfrogging claims from the men who, want to have their pay uprated along with the women who've got theirs uprated?
I mean, it is difficult to avoid. The reason I flagged the risk of leapfrog claims is because when you are obviously briefing your senior team or starting to look at your equal pay audit and address your inequalities, you do need to bear it in mind as a potential risk factor and in terms of the liability and the financial costs that you're looking at. So you can't just be looking at the female population group, and you might need to in some way, bargain and even out any contractual changes to include men that will be able to equalise themselves up. Obviously, if you're going to completely address all your pay and grading and salary, and you do the whole working population, then that's one way of making sure you preempt those types of claims.
And then somebody's raised the point about the executive directors who are likely to have the highest pay. Are they included? Short answer, yes, unless they're in a separate legal entity. And at the moment, the reporting relates to legal entities, not groups. And another question, are there any penalties for not reporting the gender pay gap by the 2018 deadline? That's an interesting legal question.
And at the moment, this is all about both peer pressure and public pressure and public scrutiny. So there are no direct penalties at the moment. That isn't to say that we can rule out altogether penalties being introduced at a later date. So I think that's a possibility.
It's going to be reviewed, right, Audrey?
Exactly, yes. You know, the pressure that you might get from unions and from individual claims is another element.
And the final question, is there any likelihood that the 250 employee threshold will go down?
I'm doubtful about that because there is a concern about red tape and small employers. I think it will be a much smaller figure, Andrew. I don't know what your view is when they extend this, as they say, the government say they will, to the public sector.
Yes, I concur. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So we've had a lot of questions today, just as we had with the first webinar. It's an issue that's obviously sparking enormous interest and concern in the corporate sector. And we're just going to finish by indicating how we can help with the challenges that lie ahead. On the legal side, Fox Williams is able to deploy its legal expertise on compliance with the regulations and advising on how to change contractual terms or deal with inequalities in pay that the whole exercise throws up. We can do it under legal privilege, working with Aon as well on their analysis if that's helpful. And we obviously have a lot of experience of defending claims and dealing with employment litigation in general, should the worst happen and you be facing equal pay claims. So, Andrew, how can Aon help?
Thanks, Jane. So here at Aon, I guess many of you will know we specialise in job evaluation and grading, but we do have a great deal of experience in providing advice around the analytics of equal pay. And as you mentioned, we have often done that under a legal framework, under a framework of legal privilege. And we can provide support from simply on advice on approach and methodology through to actually conducting the full equal pay audit itself. So perhaps, Jane, if I wrap up.
Yes, Andrew, I think it's been great being here with you and your colleagues today, and I think we're looking forward to the next one. But perhaps you could just indicate what our future plans are.
Sure. Well, if I can just start by mentioning a couple of initiatives. One is we'll shortly be launching a survey on gender pay gap benchmarks. I think there's a great deal of interesting organisations wanting to understand not only their own gap, but also the relative gap to peers in their industry. So more on that to come. We're also about to release a short research initiative on what companies are doing to prepare for gender pay gaps, just a very short pulse survey. And we'll distribute all of these initiatives in our follow-up email, along with the slides and the recording of this webinar today, so please do look out for that. There's also more to come from us. This is the second in a series of webinars on this topic that we're hosting with Fox Williams. And there'll be another webinar once the final regulations are published. So, to close out the session today, firstly I'd like to thank Fox Williams for sharing their legal expertise in what I think we all agree is certainly a complex area. And finally, I'd like to sincerely thank all of you for joining this webinar and sharing your questions and observations. Your feedback on the last webinar certainly helped inspire our own thinking on this legislation and allowed us to more comprehensively contribute to the government consultation. And of course, from today's call, we'll also be feeding back to ACAS as they develop their guidance material. We wish you all a very good day. Goodbye.